Hello, and welcome to the Shifting Culture podcast, in which we have conversations about the culture we create and the impact we can make. We long to see the body of Christ look like Jesus. I'm your host, Joshua Johnson. Go to shiftingculturepodcast.com to interact or donate. And don't forget to hit the follow button on your favorite podcast app to be notified when new episodes come out each Tuesday. And it would help us out if you would go leave a rating and review on that app. So go right now, just click 5 stars. It's easy, and it helps us reach more listeners so that they can enjoy these great conversations we are having here. Previous guests on the show have included Andrew Root, George Yancey, and JT Thomas. You could go back, listen to those episodes and more, but today's guest is Josh Buck. Josh is a church planter, filmmaker, teacher, and faith-based entrepreneur. He's a co-founder of PAX, a Christian organization designed to inspire and equip the next generation through slow, beautiful, Jesus-centered content created by people of color. His latest book is Everyday Activism. We have a great conversation around kingdom flourishing and engaging in social change and the good of others in a way that is practical and sustainable. I know you're going to enjoy my conversation with J.W. Buck. Well, Josh, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for jumping on. I'm excited to talk to you.
That's right. Thanks, Josh.
Yeah, I'd love to hear your journey of moving from just being a churchgoer, doing all the church things, to really discovering really the biblical Jesus, of what he was all about, and then your active participation in holistic transformation and kingdom flourishing for people and places.
I appreciate it, and thanks for having me on. I grew up in a church that was started out of a Billy Graham crusade in the Northwest, a wonderful church, and really came out of Baptist conservative churches that really tried to follow Jesus, but I would say translated Jesus into my home culture and really just endorsed the type of middle to upper class lifestyle that I came from. I mean, in some ways that I still inhabit. And I just want to say off the bat, that's very normal for anybody across the world that follows Jesus to translate Jesus into their home culture. And we have a habit of viewing God through our lens and through who we are in our culture. And there are pros to that, as we're all made in the image of God. And there's also some drawbacks to that. And one of the drawbacks that I learned growing up in the types of churches that I was in the Northwest, grew up outside of Seattle, born in Texas, was that the gospel was very divided between the spiritual life that we have and I would say acts of justice and mercy or human flourishing or kingdom movement was very secondary and optional. Really, the gospel was privatized and individualistic and had to do with sinning less and being a nicer person and being a kinder person. And really kind of the bleeding edge was going to more programs and maybe tied in more, perhaps going on a short-term mission. And as important as all of those things are, I really missed out on the fullness of the gospel. And I moved to California to go to Bible college. I really got saved, Josh, out of high school, even though I grew up in the church. I had a pretty typical, I would say, youth group church experience within white evangelical America that I'm thankful for. Coming to Jesus out of high school, moving to California, I was sitting in Bible college classes, the life of Christ, and having to do the work of understanding Jesus in his historical context, on his own terms. And as I did that, I was like, this is interesting. I haven't met a white Jesus. I haven't met a middle-class Jesus. I haven't met a Jesus that just automatically endorses the type of life that I came from. And that was startling to me because I was like, man, there's a big gap. Because every single time I learned about Jesus growing up, it was How can this make you a better, nicer person that sins less in your everyday life? And Jesus had this public, radical, disruptive edge to him that was jarring. So that's a little bit of the story. So going from, I would say, 0, because formation starts early, to 18 was in white evangelical America. And I still was in that in California, in the suburbs. But then I'm getting to know the Jewish Messiah and a rabbi that was very disruptive. And that was from 19, and I'm 36 now. And I'm still on this journey of understanding, what does it mean to follow Jesus in America from my social location, and husband, father, where I am. So it's a little bit about the wrestlings.
So as you're saying, you're still in this journey of what does it really mean to follow Jesus in the midst of what you're doing. What are some things that you've seen around you that you said, hey, this may be a type of injustice. This may not be the way that the world should work. If Jesus came to bring some flourishing for all people, the people around me are not really flourishing. How did you get into the space of, I need to follow Jesus in a way where we're helping all people around us?
Yeah. So in the book I wrote, Everyday Activism, in the first chapter, I talk about how in Genesis, God created all humans to be made in the image of God, and that we as humans are the jewel of God's creation, and God's divine fingerprint has been placed on each and every human throughout all of world history. And the implications of this are expansive.
Yeah.
And one of the implications is that all humans deserve dignity and respect, irrespective of any way we're classified by ourselves, by our family, by the world around us. And so that means that we have a responsibility as those made in the image of God to care for people around us and creation. And so to me, it's a very biblical value to recognize that everybody has been created by God with a worth that cannot be measured, and therefore everybody should be extended rights and protections in order that everybody is taken care of. And this means that people have access to a saving knowledge of Jesus, and there's clean running water, and people don't go without a meal, so that when they show up to school as kids, they're hungry and having a hard time getting educated. It means that we live free of the fear of violence and interpersonal violence and domestic violence. And what does it look like for Christians to mobilize to care for each other? And so that's the starting point. And then as I'm sitting in Bible college, I'm learning about the gospel of Jesus Christ. And I grew up understanding the gospel to be a lot about justification by faith, and the gospel being really fixed in the epistles of Paul, which that's a very reformed starting point. You're going to go to Romans, you're going to go to Galatians in order to understand the gospel. While there's nothing wrong with that, the interesting thing is Jesus decides to frame his entire gospel from within this Hebrew concept of Jubilee. And Jubilee is a Hebrew concept found in Leviticus 25, where God said, I want to reorder Israel so that the slaves go free. You can go back to the land that you originally owned, maybe generations ago, that you lost. God put a stop to predatory lending, and he said all the animals in creation can rest. If you're overworking everybody, your employees and the ground and the animals, I'm going to make you stop so that everybody can experience rest. And it was called the year of the Lord's favor, or Jubilee. And that was Leviticus 25, and God commanded his people from the top down to do that. And then fast forward to Isaiah 61, it's interesting that Isaiah picks up on Leviticus 25 to talk about the Messiah to come.
Yeah.
Which was very interesting for him to do that. And then in Luke 4, at the very beginning of the ministry of Jesus, he opens up by quoting Isaiah 61, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. Yeah. He's anointed me to proclaim the gospel to the poor, liberty to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind. He says the year of the Lord's favor. And then Jesus had the mic drop moment where he says, today this is fulfilled in your hearing.
Yeah.
And then moving forward from Luke 4, for the majority of the New Testament is Luke and Acts, this two-part series that this Gentile Luke wrote. That's the majority of what we have, is couched in this Jubilee manifesto from Luke 4. And so as a young Bible college student, I'm going, ooh, this is a much different reading of the gospel than Romans Road. As important as the Romans Road is, it's more expansive. And so the gospel, to clarify, is about spiritual life and social flourishing. That's what Jubilee means. Yep. And that's what we could argue biblically is justice. The word shalom or mishpat that we see as the signpost throughout the entire Old Testament leading to Jesus. And Jesus explicitly makes justice central to the work of the gospel, not something added on.
Yeah.
So to circle back to your question, Josh, really quick, like some of the issues, I mentioned a few of them, but one is I started working with children diagnosed with autism and various special needs in a very wealthy suburb of Los Angeles, Simi Valley, California. And I'm in these group homes, and I'm learning for the first time as somebody who traveled to Mexico and to Europe to work at orphanages that, whoa, this is 21st century modern day orphanages in North America.
Wow.
So many of these kids are underserved. So many of these kids have been abandoned by their family members. So many of these kids have put so much pressure on their families that they're struggling to stick together. And then I'm looking at the churches and going, and the churches really aren't aware how hard it is for parents that have kids with special needs. And the group home system is like this social catch-all where the state is trying to take care of them. But I'm also seeing how these kids are taken advantage of by working there and seeing the people running these group homes. And within me, Josh, I'm realizing that injustice surrounds us, and it's not a matter of if it exists. We all like to pretend we live in a pretty wonderful, beautiful society. It's not a matter of if, it's where and how. And do we have the boldness to push into those issues? And to be honest with you, the group home system in a wealthy suburb where people are taking advantage of these kids and they're being abandoned was a huge wake-up call for me.
Yeah, that's huge and big wake-up call. There's a couple places I'd love to dive into. One is that, the flourishing for all, the Jubilee that Christ had come to give, this gospel message that is good news of the kingdom. The Jews weren't really excited about it when they figured out it was good news for all people and not just for the Jews. It's not just the Jews that are going to be reestablished to a new position in the community, but, also the Assyrians and also, everybody else around them, the lepers and so on and so forth, and the widows. And we're like, I don't like that. So they're trying to throw Jesus off a cliff, and he gets around them. But really, that extends to today, where we're saying, hey, there's some social flourishing, kingdom flourishing for all people, and all people actually deserve to this good news of the kingdom and to be walking into the kingdom of God. But people get angry that it's not just for them, it's actually for all people. How can we engage in some holistic transformation when it includes everybody and we just don't know how to get along?
Josh, you hit the nail on the head. First off, anybody listening, open up your Bible or your phone to Luke 4 to look at the story as it unfolds, because as you just said, brother, Jesus talks about Jubilee. He illustrates it by bringing up two Old Testament prophets that were loving people outside of the Commonwealth of Israel to say, this is a mark of my ministry. I'm not just coming to the Jews, I'm coming to the Gentiles and the world. And like you said, they tried to kill him. I think it's very important to say is this the gospel that we believe? Is this going to be our starting point? Are we really going to let the gospel be the gospel of Jesus Christ? Are we going to let Jesus define for us what the gospel is?
Yeah.
Or are we going to find a reading that just suits our life better? And that's been something that's haunted me as a Christian in a very healthy way. So that's the first thing. And, you know, we do live in really polarized, divided times, like way more than we've ever been polarized before, because of social media and because of the news cycle and so many globalization, so many reasons. And in the book is called Everyday Activism because I'm really trying to encourage people that are already too busy, already feel like they're too broken and afflicted personally to make a massive difference in the world. And this is another key as you read the four gospels. Jesus went to people who were busy and broken and overwhelmed and mobilized them for the work of the gospel and for the kingdom. And that struck me as somebody who always feels like I'm not good enough. I can't do it.
Yeah.
Anytime I step out and say something, I'm going to get killed by one side or the other. I'm always being looked at through the political left or the political right. And you just feel paralyzed by this cultural moment. Yet, you know what? The 99% of us that aren't going to make the halls of history and like become these famous people, that's who Jesus came to save and mobilize for the work of ministry. So in the book, I talk about how you can create social change and not quit your job.
Yeah.
You don't have to go get a specialized degree on international policy. You don't have to join the UN. You don't need specialized training. What does it look like to follow Jesus on a daily basis? Because that's who Jesus came to train and mobilize and empower. And so there were 7 practices that I highlight from the life and ministry of Jesus to get us started, no matter who you are, no matter what your day looks like. A single mom, a working mom, a guy who's like stuck in a job, hating it, working night shifts. How can you actually create social change where you are and grow where you're planted?
So let's take a couple of those practices. So as you know, you're talking, that's actually good news for some people that you could actually start where you are, and you don't have to make this huge change and transition and life change. And you don't even have to be burnt out in the end. You could actually do it sustainably over the long haul. So what's 1 or 2 practices that we could start to engage in now that we could say, I could enter into this space?
So the first one I draw attention to is love. And I go to the parable of the Good Samaritan in the Gospel of Luke. I love this story because it's actually a very ordinary situation where somebody's traveling along a publicly traveled road and they find somebody that's hurting on the side of the road, which actually would have happened on this road. And the Samaritan comes across a Jewish person and intercedes and helps them. And what I talk about is right now in North America, in the United States in particular, we have a culture of fear and suspicion and division, and our definition of neighbor is shrinking because of it. When we feel threatened, who we consider the people worth loving, just the list gets smaller and smaller, and the circle shrinks.
Yeah.
And I talk about how in this parable, Jesus challenges our conception of neighboring. I grew up thinking my neighbors were police officers because they lived around us, and firefighters because my dad is a firefighter and lived around us, then Boeing engineers because of the neighborhood we lived in the Northwest. And that is how I defined my neighbors. And so when I hear love God and love neighbor, I'm like, okay, well, I love God, and then I love the people that live around me, that vote like me, that speak English like me, that go to the same restaurants that my family goes to, that drive similar vehicles. and they just are in the same social strata as my family. And what we learn from this ancient text of Luke is that Jesus is disrupting our conception of neighboring, because he's saying to love your neighbor is to find the people, befriend the people in your everyday life, in family, in your workplace, as you come across them in your commute, when you wake up, whatever it is, the people in your life that are not only difficult to love, but they aren't going to speak the same language. They aren't going to have the same religious convictions as you. They are going to be the cultural outsider in your midst.
Yeah.
And those are the people that are your biblical neighbor. And what I show is Jesus expects us to love our neighbor, the outsider, in the same way that Jesus loved us, the outsiders, when he was on the cross. And the neighbor love that God extended to us through Jesus on the cross is meant to be extended in tangible acts of compassion and mercy in our daily life. And so that's the first of the 7 where we get into what it actually tangibly looks like to follow the radical practices of Jesus.
Yeah, and so if you want to be a good neighbor, so, the first practice is to love, to reorder our mind to know who the biblical neighbor is, and that's very helpful. As we look in the Good Samaritan story, some of the things that I like about that, what the Samaritan does for the Jew, one is he does the work of bandaging the wounds right away, and then he gets them to a place that could do some long-term recovery. And then he pays for it, right? And so he gives them to the end. They could do some long-term recovery. And oftentimes we don't know which part to play in the transformation of things. We don't know if I should just do it all for somebody else, or if I should just do one part, or am I overstepping my bounds in this area? And we also have spheres of society and culture that don't really talk to one another. And you say group homes and churches aren't talking to one another when it comes to, your work with kids with autism. There's all sorts of people that are siloed in their areas, and they don't know who's covering which area. They don't know if they're overstepping or not. How can we then start to work together holistically with others to be able to do this work in an everyday setting where it's not my full-time job?
Such an important question. I would say, because I can only speak to the culture that I've come from in white evangelical spaces, we have to be really careful with how we answer this question, because one, those that come from privilege or wealth, or those that aren't afflicted on a daily basis with a lot of the injustices that people face, whether it's an extremely broken family or domestic violence, or not having enough food or shelter, or the healthcare to get by, we choose to engage and disengage when we want to. I feel this way about like the race conversation in general, is I choose to engage it and disengage it because I'm not afflicted by my racial category as a white dude.
Yeah.
So the question that we need to ask when we desire to get involved is, where's my place? And this is where I borrow from the principles of CCDA, Christian Community Development Association, or Dr. Perkins, and a lot of the work that they've done is the solution to the problems that people face is with the people that face them. In other words, when you're looking to address injustice, go to, be with, live among, befriend those who are suffering from those things, and ask them, how can someone like me help? How can I, if at all, how can I help? And so that's an important starting point. There's a book called When Helping Hurts that talks about how so many times people can get involved and have a savior mentality that they have to be the one to do the rescuing or plug in. And like you said, communication isn't good. And so that was a huge lesson for me traveling in my late teens, early 20s. Is you go to a country like Uganda, where I spent a lot of time, and you have a ton of people spending money without actually asking locals, is this what is needed and beneficial for the flourishing of this country, for this church and this community? And the thing was, as I got to know a lot of local pastors, they had a lot of really negative things to say about missionaries, NGOs, and the millions of dollars of investment that really weren't going to help their people. And why is that? Well, a good idea in the wrong area is a bad idea.
Yep.
And so that's the first part, okay? That you can actually do more harm when you want to help than good. So actually live incarnationally like Jesus and have the cultural humility to go into, let's say it's like the refugee crisis or immigration, or it's the abortion issue, or elder neglect, or the group home system, or healthcare. You really think everybody should have healthcare? Whatever these big issues are, going to the people affected the most in the most dignifying way that you can in learning. And there's so many ways to do that is step one. Step two, at the end of the book, I have a justice matrix. And in the justice matrix, I talk about finding the work of justice that you're called to. And in the matrix, the vertical side, we have local, regional justice issues, national, and international. And so thinking about what are the issues that I'm drawn to, and then on the horizontal side of the matrix, we have prevention work, where we're preventing injustice, intervention, and reclamation. And it's really important when we think about injustice to realize that prevention work is often the easiest type of work. That can be like after school arts for kids in an area where there's a lot of poverty and gang activity and social disparity. So you have after school arts with kids, you partner with local schools. And intervention is to say, these kids are getting recruited into gangs. So now we're going to go into the family and try and get them out in the early stages. And that's incredibly hard to do. And I know some nonprofits that do that work. And then the reclamation work is to say, these different teenagers are pregnant and these different folks are in prison because they got caught into this web of injustice. And now how do we reclaim what's been lost or broken? And I think for anybody that's reading my book, that's like, okay, I get the whole, no matter what I do every day, I need to like be active in my faith, but I care about this issue.
Yeah.
The justice matrix helps you frame the work that you want to do. And in the appendices, I give some practical steps like don't be harmful when you're trying to help.
Yeah.
On how to get there.
Yeah. Have you seen anything that has been helpful when it comes to different areas in cities to have more of a holistic conversation of how to help holistically and not just in different silos?
Yeah, so I'll speak a little bit to the context in which we planted a church. We moved into Northeast LA, my wife and I and my daughter, back in 2010, and then we were there for about 12 years, 11 years, something like that in the LA area to plant a church. And I would say the biggest anecdotal lessons that I take, when I say anecdotal, I mean, this is not research-based. There's a lot of research-based answers to your question. Yeah. But actually going to the different cultural systems when you enter a neighborhood, asking a set of similar questions. So it's basic anthropology work or doing qualitative research, which is to say, we went to the LAPD Northeast Division and said, tell us about the neighborhood. Do you have the trust of the people? What nonprofits exist? When and how did you work with nonprofits, formally or informally? And they say, well, we started a boxing ring for young men, and this is what we do, and this is how it helps. And these are the struggles that we have as a police force because of the different ways we've treated the Hispanic population historically to earn their trust back. And then I went to the recreation centers and talked to the directors. And so they're in the city too. We met with single moms. We hung out with kids. We also went to local coffee shops and restaurants. And we asked the series of questions that were very similar to say, what are the cultural values in the neighborhood? What are the pressure points that I'm learning about? And where does the gospel and the kingdom of God and Jubilee intersect the work that we're doing in the neighborhood as people that moved in and the needs of the neighborhood? And how does the gospel come to bear in those spaces? So to summarize, you have to be highly communicative. 1, 2, you have to display a lot of cultural humility in that you're going in saying, this isn't my neighborhood. It's never going to be my home neighborhood.
Yeah.
So how do I come alongside the people? And 3, what does it look like to find the solution with the people that live in the neighborhood?
Yeah.
Not outside of the neighborhood. And you think of any counseling relationship, and some people that are listening to this might go to a counselor or a therapist, or they've gotten pastoral counseling. The times when you have an aha moment on your own is where you learn the most.
Yep.
From a pedagogical perspective, like an education perspective.
Yep.
It's not when someone's telling you what to do and how to do it. It's where you arrive yourself to that conclusion. And this is the work of Christians in justice, in my opinion. This is where we should be, is we just with people, not trying to give answers, not trying to fix problems, but wrestling alongside difficult subjects and trying to come to healthier conclusions.
Yeah, I think that's really important to go in and actually go holistically talk to a bunch of different people in different spheres and say what's happening, what is the culture like, and where are we headed, what are the problems, what are the good things in this community, and where can we fit into the space. And I think that's a very, very humble, curious perspective that you come into a place and a culture. And I think that's very necessary and needed as outsiders going into a place and becoming like and becoming around the people there. You know, one of the things, and I think, you have an interest, I think you have an interest in the arts. And the arts themselves, I think, within culture are one of the places where it has the biggest prophetic voice. And I, see within the kingdom, and then within Christian circles, a lot of times the Christian art has veered away from having a prophetic voice. And we've actually relegated that prophetic arts voice to others. And say, the films of Jordan Peele are very prophetic, and he's using a prophetic voice. There's a lot of musical artists that are speaking out through their songs, voices of injustice. This is happening, and it actually starts to mobilize and galvanize people around certain issues. How can we, as faithful followers of Jesus, be engaged in the arts, use a prophetic voice, and help bring about some restoration and hope and flourishing to the world?
Josh, I love the question around the arts. There's something about the arts in particular, whether it's comedy or music or painting or graphic design, that help communicate truth in a way that gets to people where argumentation and debate and logic fall short, actually. Yeah. Especially in this cultural moment where there aren't any agreed upon rules of engagement when it comes to debate.
Yep.
the arts can play a huge place in the work of the kingdom, in the work of Jubilee, to deliver God's message and gospel and truth and love in a hurting world. And so the work that we do at Made for PAX, madeforpax.org is our website. Something that's really important for us to realize for those that are looking to spread the gospel in the world is baby boomers were asking the question, what is true? And the apologetics movement was huge. And it was very much born out of modernity, that we can have certainty and we have to fight against like misconceptions and lies and relativism and atheism and all that. And then, millennials are asking the question, what is good? And there's a bigger suspicion of authority, and there's less of a loyalty to institutions and just chasing our dreams to make the world a better place. I'm not sure about Gen X because everybody skips over them, so I will too. And then you get to Gen Z, and the younger generations are asking the question, what is beautiful? The wonderful thing is the gospel answers all of these questions. What is true? What is good? What is beautiful? It's up to us as faith leaders to contextualize and bring the gospel to the next generation and answering that question. How does Jesus intersect beauty? How does the gospel intersect my desire to be pulled with music and poetry and spoken word and graphic design and a conversation, the art of a conversation, which is one of the reasons why podcasts have exploded.
Yeah.
And I think that's a key question we have to answer in order to be reaching upcoming generations. So the arts will always have a very key part of it. And I'll speak to the book really quick. For those just listening, I'm like holding the book I wrote, Everyday Activism. And for me, like when I read a book, I have a hard time, and I've read a lot of books, okay?
Yeah.
I have a really hard time reading a book if I can't visualize like the argument.
Yeah.
I can get lost. I'm like, I'm not smart enough. I don't understand it. It's harder for me to follow. And so for me, I was like, I can't write a book unless I can literally draw the whole thing out in one picture. That's what I have to do. And that's a part of what I've done in the book, is to say, this is exactly what I'm talking about in all of the book. And so I worked with an incredible graphic designer out of Oregon, Danny Canales, with 50 plus custom designed images to help illustrate the points I'm making, because for those of us that are visual learners, more maybe than we're going to learn by just reading, it's critical. And so that's even me making an overture to try and bring in the arts into what I'm doing when I am not a graphic designer at all. But how can we bring these worlds together to help people learn about Jesus?
Yeah, I love that. And I do really appreciate, I love the visuals of your book, and it was extremely helpful to be able to see that and see those pictures drawn out, those diagrams. I think that helps all of us grasp it in a different way and make it more real. My question is, so then in the arts, how do we faithfully steward that work in the arts to actually use our voices to say what is true and what is good, what is beautiful?
This has been the complete experiment of our organization, PAX. PAX is Latin for peace. And when you look at our publications that we call story arcs, let's take mental health, for example. We bring people into a multi-sensory discipleship pathway. And what do we mean by that? Well, we're bringing people from start to finish to understand the issue of mental health from a Jesus-centered perspective. And we are integrating artists into the discipleship process. And we're saying you have voice and agency and the right to speak about this issue of mental health as an artist. You might not be a theologian, you might not be a scholar, you might not be an academic, but here is some material that's about mental health, and please bring your gift to bear on this issue. And that's what we've been trying to do at PAX since we started a few years ago during the pandemic. It is to integrate. So if you want to see a group of primarily millennials experiment on what it looks like to faithfully steward the gifts of artists in the faith space, madeforpax.org is a great place to go to check it out. There's a bunch of other organizations that also do incredible work in that space. We certainly are not ahead of the curve or anything like that. And as somebody who is very much in love with the local church, I've always lamented that, like, you can't really serve as an artist in a local church unless you have Chris Tomlin's like vocal range and can play the guitar.
Yeah,
it's those two things.
Yeah,
you gotta be, a guy who could sing really high and play 4 chords on the guitar, and you're ready to go in church until the day you die. Maybe if you play the piano, you're in there too. Maybe if you play drums. Literally, a band a lot of times is our imagination for what it looks like to integrate the arts into spiritual formation, which you cut out a massive chunk of the population that thinks differently. Like Dave Chappelle thinks differently than the rest of us.
Right.
Keenan Peele thinks differently than the rest of us, and we need their gift in the world to deliver hard truth. And imagine that the hundreds of thousands of Christians that are in that same category, women and men and young people, that need that outlet in order to express their faith. And I just would encourage people listening, who cares if you're not an artist? What does it look like to create space for artists around you in whatever church that you're in?
I really hope that happens, that there's a resurgence. I know that what we're talking about in our local church community is a resurgence of the arts and figuring out how to steward that and what that looks like. That's one of, we're talking about a lot of things, but that's one of the things that some people are like, I really feel like there is this resurgence of the arts that is bubbling up. And, our church was, a lot of the foundations of our church, the beginnings of it was just a bunch of crazy young artists starting to discover and figure out what following Jesus looks like, and how do we do this in the city in which we live, and what does it look like. And so as we're trying to figure out what do we do on a night where we have people reading out poetry, and what do we do for a night where we're actually creating things on canvas and painting, and what do we do and to actually steward people through what they feel that is coming out of them, whether it be a brief little skit, or if it's a whatever it is that is coming out of them. How do we help them in their journey towards Jesus bring that out and steward that? And I think that's a really good question for all of us and for the church and the community, where art and the arts was a forefront in the church for a long time in the world. And we see a lot of our greatest works of art came through the church, and so let's do that again, and let's steward the resurgence of the arts and give a voice to the artists, and so a good prophetic voice to speak truth and beauty and goodness in the world, so we can see kingdom flourishing. So Josh, I'd love to know, if you could go back to your 21-year-old self, what advice would you give?
First thing I would tell myself is, don't take yourself so seriously, which my 21-year-old self would have taken that very seriously and probably not known how to internalize it. Still would have been like, just fire. Yeah, in my 20s, and I struggle with all the same things I dealt with in my 20s, even though I'm sure I've grown a lot. But, my seriousness was a mixture of, overworking and insecurity and overconfidence. It's a really weird mixture of things where I think I would probably sit down and in a gentle way talk to my 21-year-old self about that. And the second thing I would have told my 21-year-old self, or I would, is lessons in rest and lessons in retreat. There's a whole chapter in the book on it. For those that are advocates of justice, we have a hard time resting and stopping and slowing down because you feel the weight of the world and injustice constantly. And I feel that on a daily basis. I wake up almost every day going, what am I doing with my life? Like, a child dies every 4 seconds of starvation, and like I'm like going to go get a coffee. What am I doing? And so to slow down and rest is something outside of my spiritual formation naturally. So that's the second thing I would try to impress on my younger self.
That's good. Anything you've been reading, watching lately you could recommend?
A book that is a really good starting point is by Oscar Romero. It's called The Violence of Love. And he was an El Salvadorian priest who was killed while preaching and administering the Eucharist in celebration of somebody who had been killed for being a journalist in a society where the truth didn't have a very good public hearing. And Romero is one of those prophetic voices and witnesses of Jubilee in the world. And I love this book because it's not academic. It's not making arguments. It's his poems and prayers and letters. And so you talk about the arts. It gets to your heart in a way that most books won't. It's kind of like Bonhoeffer's Letters and Papers from Prison, where before he was killed for conspiring to kill Hitler, he's writing these very vulnerable letters from prison to family members and friends. And there's a window into those men with those books. Those are two examples that I circle back to on a regular basis, and I think those are two that I would suggest.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. People go out and get your book, Everyday Activism, which I highly recommend. It's really good. It's fantastic. So well done. And it's practical and it's easy for people and accessible so that people can actually engage in this. What do you want to say to people reading your book and people listening, and they want to really take some steps into this? What would you like them to get out of your book?
If nothing else, I would love people to take away two things, Josh. The first is the gospel is holistic. It's about spiritual life, placing our faith in King Jesus for the salvation from our sins, to live an eternal life with God, okay? It's spiritual life. It's all those things. It's also social flourishing. And it's two sides of the same coin. You can't have one without the other. So that's the first thing. If you take away anything from the book, read the first 2 chapters, and if you toss it down after that, fine. The gospel is holistic. And the second thing that I would love people to take away is a deeper understanding of Jesus. I hope more than anything, this book gets people in the Gospels, understanding who Jesus is on his own terms, so that we understand we're following this radical Jewish rabbi, Messiah, King, Lord, Son of Man, I am. And we've been brought into this relationship with him. And now we follow him on a daily basis. I would love people to open their Bibles more and learn about the Jesus from the 4 Gospels.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I love that. And so, yeah, it's great. So as we enter into this everyday activism, as we figure out who this Jesus truly is, and we start to follow Jesus, and, we are going to be well on our way. So I thank you, Josh, for this conversation. I think it was helpful for people to see Jesus in all of life, that it's actually holistic, and we are going to see some jubilee. This is the good news, the kingdom that he brought, and that we are still working as he is redeeming all things, making all things new. And I'm excited to see what is going to happen for all the people that are going to start to engage a little bit more holistically and say, hey, I could do this in my everyday life. So thank you for this conversation. It was great talking to you.
Thanks for having me, Josh.
Thank you for listening to the show today. If you're really enjoying the show, please don't forget to hit the follow button on your favorite podcast app. You could do it right now. Just hit that little plus. And then I would love it if you would leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. So you could go right now to the show and leave a star rating and review, and let us know how you are enjoying the show. And find us on Facebook and Instagram. So if you want to connect, interact, I post a lot of quotes and different things that you could actually interact with the episodes and let me know how you are enjoying the show. If you feel inclined to donate, there is a support the show link in the show notes, and it would send you directly to a page where you could donate so that new episodes can be produced for your enjoyment. So thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have an incredible week.